Throne and Liberty is here, and on the eve of the global launch after 12 plus years in development, and substandard results from the December launch in its home market that were so bad that, well, they actually kind of somewhat announced that Guild Wars 3 may or may not be coming during an NCSoft earnings call to kind of soften the blow a little bit of what was going on with Throne and Liberty. After playing the MMO for about 30 hours so far in the testing that we've been getting in the regional version, the global launch version that is being published not by NCSoft but by Amazon Game Studios, well, I'm worried about my prediction that I made about 6 months ago when it comes to Throne and Liberty. This one. My first prediction is all going to be about perhaps one of the biggest MMOs launching that was supposed to launch last year, Throne and Liberty. I predict that Throne and Liberty will launch. It's going to break Lost Ark's record for MMO peak on Steam and then crash down to earth once players get tired of it and or they encounter monetization holdovers from its Korean release that are really untenable. I'm expecting something more like Lost Ark than New World though, with a big drop but not a sheer cliff of a drop. There's one big part of that prediction that I don't think is going to come through. But to really understand that, I need to ask you a couple questions. One that is launching this year with incredible animations, graphics, and zone design. An MMO with dungeons, both instance and open world, crafting, PvP and PvE, and surprisingly good performance with tons and tons of players on screen. An MMO with sky whales of all things. Sky whales that you can actually ride. Whee! Whee! And then fly off of. Whee! But what if it was also an MMO that used the level 1 through 50 process as kind of an extended tutorial? One where you're railroaded into following solo story for advancement. If it relied heavily on enchanting systems instead of unique item identity, putting instead the strength of your items behind a crafting system that may or may not include many real-world purchases. What if that MMO essentially was just a worse version of Final Fantasy XIV in the same year that Final Fantasy XIV launched a brand new expansion with a graphical update? Or one that does things that WoW does, just a little bit more convoluted, buried beneath systems that strip away achievement, also at a time when World of Warcraft is launching the beginning of a whole new saga of expansions. Oh yeah, and with all this, throw in a monetization system that has some extreme potential for abuse, and with that, you get Throne and Liberty, an MMO that is awash with all the sins of the modern MMO and some of the benefits of the modern MMO, as well as benefits of having a shit ton of money. Perhaps the largest MMO launch of 2024 that is not an expansion, and one that to me, unfortunately, is the absolute 100% definition of what I would consider a filler MMO. An MMO that you play for a little while and leave. Lost Ark 2.0. A game that doesn't do anything spectacularly well, and unfortunately, and sadly, regrettably, for the entire genre of the MMORPG, will sadly probably be very forgettable this time next year. Let's talk about it. Let's start with the good, though, after that not so nice intro, the things that the games do well. The first thing that does verge on being done exceptionally well has to be performance. It's the thing that we have to talk about out of the gate because it needs to be lauded. The game seems to handle a ton of players on screen at once with very little issue. I think this is something they did from the ground up with the idea of huge PvP battles and PvE raids, and to their credit, they have achieved it. It's probably on par with games like Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft in this regard, and it does all this while having our second positive, though it still can be a bit of a memory hog. The second positive is the beauty of the game, the world, the animations, etc. The game is beautiful. Built in Unreal Engine 4, you can immediately tell a ton of budget went into art, from animations to armor to the world itself with spectacular draw distance. This is an absolutely gorgeous game for an MMO. It's constructed in a way to give stunning vistas with great lighting and satisfying skill effects. It's 100% a game that puts graphics first, and it shows, for good and for ill. But it also has one of the coolest features when you enter a new area that I hope more MMOs will add. A zone lore stone that gives you a flyover of the zone and tells you a bit of its history. Really just getting you engaged with that area of the world.
Underground temple built long ago. Before the war with the Lightbringer Society, it was the largest temple of Silivith in Aden. The Great War with the Lightbringer Society resulted in the deaths of most of the Shadowmancers here. Now, only a few surviving followers remain to roam the halls.
It's also important to note that difficulty ramps up significantly after what felt like, quite honestly, a joke of a game to begin with. For the first 10 levels or so, combat feels absolutely atrocious. Largely because NPCs just kind of fall over for you. We were taking on things 5+ levels higher than us and never felt any danger. That changes as difficulty ramps up significantly as you get deeper into the leveling process, which essentially only takes a few hours. It begins as a game that feels as simplistic and easy as Terrace Land, but later provides more depth and difficulty. Though I wouldn't exactly use a term like fear or challenge in this, but it does become at least somewhat more satisfying. Speaking of satisfying, combat isn't nearly as bad as some other creators may say. Level 1 to 10ish is pretty trash, mindless, silly, no challenge at all. But that all shifts around 15+ when you get a slightly larger kit of abilities and enemies become more difficult and you have to think, like when to heal, when to CC, make sure you get your timed blocks and parries in. There are of course issues with combat, some things don't really quite fit, but for a tab target MMO it does a solid job with its timed parrying, ground effect avoidance, and dodging through morphing, as well as customizable skill sets. My biggest concerns weren't the basis of combat, but rather how you advance it. But more on that later when we get to the negatives. One thing you won't be lacking for in Throne and Liberty is something to do. Whether it's secret dungeons, which are essentially just a tower of bosses that you fight over and over and over again, or open world dungeons that are only accessible at certain times, like during the daytime. And instant dungeons that play like somewhat shorter versions of what you'd expect in Final Fantasy XIV or World of Warcraft. And there are events throughout the world, but unfortunately many of them seem reliant on being part of a guild. Again, more on that as we get to the negatives. This is a modern MMO, with all of the good things that brings, as well as all the sins of a modern MMO. So let's talk about some of those sins. This is 100% a game before a world. What I mean by that is you will be absolutely drowning in menus, quest icons, timers, and spending as much time in full screen crafting menus to enhance your items and craft your items, or checking off all the things on your battle pass and leveling pass, really all that stuff that is taking you out of the game instead of actually enjoying the beauty of the world itself. Which is an absolute shame because the world is beautiful. There was obviously a lot of time spent on making it that way, with a lot more verticality than you might think, with things like dungeons that go deep into the ground, beneath soaring castles, and islands begging to be explored. The problem is it doesn't feel like you're rewarded for doing any of that. Instead, the game will take you along its rails towards max level in what feels like a level 1 through 50 tutorial through solo only story quests. Now, to their credit, some of the story quests are actually quite fun, especially the ones that put you in smaller instances, which can at times be fun to follow along with, like, well, Final Fantasy XIV or Guild Wars 2. But outside of that, well, NPCs aren't really worth killing. Generally, they're just a waste of space in the open world unless quests demand it. They give negligible to non-existent experience, and I found that after some time traveling across the world, they became as annoying as the damn Rattata encounters in Pokemon when you're just trying to get to Route 14 and they just keep interrupting you. Perhaps this is why they had astral hunting in the first place and just never adjusted it to make the world, well, worth playing in. Basically, all of this is just to get you to the actual game. When you have people at max level within days or hours of open beta, they've basically thrown out the idea of leveling as progression. Because yes, many people were max level in this beta that lasted a week. There were people that were level 50 on the second day of the beta. They'd done everything, except they hadn't. They'd done the tutorial, and now it was time for the actual game. And the actual game is where I'm worried most of the problems actually lie. But all that leveling is railroaded into a single player partially instant story, something that has basically thrown out the world that you're in, taken players out of the world and put them on a path towards max level. Basically, the world is gone. A beautiful world that honestly, despite that, feels a bit lazy. The world is made up of a few different regions, and while the NPCs and PCs within them are spectacular, you'll quickly realize just how much this game could have benefited by sticking with the Lineage IP. Going with only humans when they had the budget to do more feels pretty freaking lazy. Just like the repeating of the same handful of NPCs in any given area for hunting. All goblins, all spiders, all the same couple knights. Getting 2 to 3 NPC visual types in large swaths of an area, making it feel more game than world. Why they didn't just stick with the Lineage IP is absolutely beyond me. It's like changing a globally known brand into a freaking letter. It was surprising to me given that they do have a wide variety of NPCs. They just didn't mix them up very much, instead seemingly focusing on streamlining quest NPCs and grind spots, gamifying the world, taking that living, breathing world of what an MMO should be and making it essentially into an arcade game with a random chance of whether you enchant your item or you fail and you have to go buy something from the marketplace. It's f***ing boring. I'm sorry, but it is. In a lot of ways, it feels like diluting this idea of a world to play in into gambling, basically. And that's kind of what I'm concerned about with the actual game, the end game parts. The things that aren't the main story or the world. It seems like they lean into the ability for server dominance from top PvP guilds with rich get richer mechanics through their current monetization, causing grave concerns for competitive balance in a game with PvP. You cannot trade with other players directly. Instead, you have to use the RMT marketplace to do so, because NCSoft and Amazon Game Studio want a cut of every transaction that happens. But it goes far beyond that. When people are talking about the monetization system in this, they're not talking enough about some of the other things, myself included, as I have learned and read more about it. Some world events require you to be part of a guild to participate. PvP castle sieges give RMT, and the winners of those sieges, the big PvP guilds, benefit from RMT taxes on the auction house. For everything sold within that castle that was besieged by that PvP guild, well, now they also get extra benefit, thus being able to buy more power from said auction house, and those taxes then going back to the same people that bought the same power, and thus being even more likely to keep control over those castles. Doesn't that sound like a great system that totally would not be abused in any way, shape, or form? Just saying. Throne and Liberty, like many MMOs in this vein, will likely have a decent player base to begin that crashes within a few months of launch, leaving nothing but whales and the hyper-competitive. There doesn't seem to be any stickiness to this game or this world. It's a game first, a world second, and you'll probably find more enjoyment out of Final Fantasy XIV's Dawn Trail or World of Warcraft's A War Within expansions this year for a new modern MMO experience. There is just simply something better out there to do than this game. The main thing this has going for it is the fact that it's new and that it has a very low barrier to entry. But then again, Final Fantasy XIV does too. But if you're looking for a filler MMO, at least this one is pretty, with some satisfying moments. There are legitimately times where I did have fun playing the game, finding things I enjoyed in the world, moments of satisfaction. But they were overwhelmed with the negatives and the potential for an abusive monetization system. The bottom line for me will always be, if your monetization is so complex as to invite confusion, it's been designed that way to invite spending and whales. But to wrap all this up, I think I can just show the shirt that I chose to wear. This shirt is pay to win. This game feels the same, and that's really disappointing. Not just for Throne and Liberty, but what may be coming down the line. Because the biggest thing of Throne and Liberty may not actually be the game, but perhaps the fact that the game studio that is publishing this game has control over the Lord of the Rings IP and is currently working on the next Lord of the Rings MMO. One of the MMOs that could be the biggest launching in the next couple years. But hey, if you want to see what other MMO predictions I got wrong, like the ones that I'm probably going to get wrong unless, like, I don't know, 500,000 of you decide to jump in this game and try it out in September, well, you can see that in this video right here. And honestly, the only one that might be worse than what I said for Throne and Liberty is probably the one about New World. That one was rough.